So I I was also over in your area, and so you might be able to see that I'm wearing the famous Santorini White Donkey Brewery shirt. And so I did the whole experience, right? So I rode the donkey up the mountain and did the whole thing. So really enjoyed seeing Santorini as well as Athens. We did some touring around there. So yeah, great to be with you all here today as well. So to get us started, we're going to start with a story. This is the story about Jim. So Jim has just finished a phone call with his boss, the VP of sales. The VP had some more bad news. Another person from Jim's team had just resigned. This makes three people leaving the company since Jim took over as sales manager. The year had started out so well, but with a performance review due any time now, Jim isn't feeling very positive about how it's going to go. So, a flashback to 6 months earlier. Jim, one of the leading sales associates at Moneybags Incorporated, has been promoted to sales manager and is now responsible for the performance of a sales team in the department where he's been thriving as an associate for years. Jim has been waiting for this day, and he's really proud and super excited about moving up in the company that's given him such success. Jim wastes no time in getting started. After all, he knows what he likes from a manager and he's got ideas on ways things could be better. His first order of business is to form his sales team. As an individual salesman, Jim excelled in his role, always meeting and usually exceeding his sales targets. Jim sees no reason why this should be any different for the members of his sales team. He has the skills and he believes that he can easily pass them on to his team members. Jim has built a team of 5 team members and immediately starts discussing sales targets and setting goals for the team. Jim wants to make a good impression in his new role, and he's excited to see the progress that his team will make. So the goals are ambitious and aggressive, but he believes his team can handle it. Everyone on the team is excited about the possibilities for upcoming fiscal quarters, and they are already imagining the best way to spend their year-end bonuses. Jim is especially excited because the targets his team set for the year are bigger than those set by other teams, especially Bob's team. Bob and Jim were promoted to sales manager at the same time, and Jim is looking for ways to stand out as a new leader compared to Bob. If I succeed, Jim thinks to himself, I will have made the most sales by revenue in the department, and the VP will definitely take notice of me and my team. As time passes, Jim takes pride in the way he leads his team. He takes them out for drinks regularly at the local watering hole as a way to build team morale and connection, which is something Jim learned from his past managers. Jim makes sure that everyone's birthdays are recognized with a cake, and he does his best to remember one personal detail about each of his employees, so he always has something to ask them about. After his first month in leadership, Jim's supervising VP comes to him with concerns about the current pace of sales from his team. Things are not as profitable as they should be. Jim explains that the current economic climate is the problem and that there's really not much his team can do about that. Jim's VP disagrees and informs Jim that his group needs to show some improvement by the end of next month. At the next team meeting, Jim shares the VP's concerns with his team. In an effort to increase productivity, Jim requests some voluntary overtime from his team members and assures them that he'll pitch in and put in overtime hours himself. Jim knows that this is something that the team has always loved about him. They know that he's willing to get his hands dirty and do the work with him. After his chat with the VP, Jim pops into Bob's office to get a pulse on how things are going for Bob's team. Tough times, eh? Jim starts out. Yeah, but we're seeing some new opportunities out there that we can take advantage of, replies Bob. How are you doing with your sales targets? Jim asks Bob. Right on target for this point in the year, states Bob. Really? Jim is surprised. Your team must be doing quite a lot of overtime. Not at all, responds Bob. It's business as usual for my team. After talking to Bob, Jim recognizes just how much work there is for his team to do to catch up with Bob's team. Jim starts thinking about growing his team to make up the deficit. Maybe if I had more team members, we could get back on track, Jim thought. By the time the end of Jim's third month as a sales manager rolls around, Jim has grown his team from 5 people all the way up to 10. And the budget for his department has inflated by double to match. Partway through his 4th month in leadership, Jim senses that the team needs a boost. So he plans a team meeting to energize them towards hitting their targets. It is still possible after all. However, during that meeting, Jim's employees started to grumble about the impossibility of achieving such enormous sales targets and complaining that the targets were too aggressive in the first place. The team asks Jim to sit down with the VP and renegotiate the targets for the remainder of the year to make them more achievable. Jim feels that such a move would look bad for him, and he feels confident that with some adjustments and hard work, the team can stay on track. We just need to work a little harder this quarter to get ahead. That's all, Jim says. Meanwhile, Bob's team continues to deliver on their targets at a good pace. Jim continues a practice that he started as soon as he became a leader, having one-on-one meetings with his team. Jim enjoys getting to know them each more personally and leaves the one-on-ones happy with all the ways he was able to help. Jim's team finds a lot of value in their one-on-ones with Jim, as he gives them a lot of great advice on how to overcome the challenges they're experiencing in their work. During month 5, Jim starts to check in on his team members individually outside of their usual one-on-ones in an effort to help and find the source of the problem. Jim also starts attending his team members' sales calls and takes on some calls of his own, to take the load off their plates. And that's when the resignation started. Jim's VP notified him of the first resignation. Then the second happened in quick succession. Why aren't my team members having this conversation with me in our one-on-ones, Jim wonders. Regardless, the targets are the targets, and Jim is running out of time. So he hires 2 new team members to replace those that resigned, and then a third person for good measure. By now, the team is so far below target that they can use all the help they can get. One day late in the year, Jim bumps into Bob in the break room and says, I see you're still on pace to hit your sales targets this year. How many extra people did you have to hire to maintain that growth? To which Bob replies, none. I have the same team I started with. Jim's not sure what's going on, and his frustration is starting to grow. So back to today. Jim is sitting at his desk, trying to figure out what's happened since he was promoted to sales manager. The situation feels hopeless. Not only has his team had difficulty rising up to the challenge that he set for them this year, he also had to start taking over some of their tasks just to get a little bit more done. Bob hasn't experienced any of these challenges, and in fact, seems to have put in very little effort at all. What's he up to? Jim ponders. Why is Bob succeeding when I'm not? And what's with all these resignations? I'm a good boss, Jim tells himself. People leaving the team just doesn't make any sense. Then Jim remembers the annual bonuses and starts to get a sinking feeling. Doing some quick math, he realizes that he's likely to receive the smallest bonus of his career. And at that moment, to add insult to injury, Jim's email pings with an invite from his boss. Performance review on Tuesday. Come prepared. Ugh, Jim's heart sinks. This isn't going to go well.
Oh Oh, poor Jim. So, we just heard a story of two leaders, and it wasn't always obvious why one was more successful than the other, but there was probably some clues in there, and I'm just curious from anybody who's either live in the room there or maybe on our Slack channel. What are some of the reasons why you think Bob might have done better than Jim? And feel free to share verbally, or you can even just put them into the Zoom chat, whatever works.
I think just because Bob trusts his team.
Can you repeat that one more time, Elena?
I think that Bob was the successful, right, on track, if I remember correctly the name.
Yes.
He just trusted his team.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you. Yeah, what
so
else?
there was a trust.
Trust. Yeah. Okay, I see some in the chat. Oh, go ahead, Ellen.
Yeah, we have some replies in the chat.
Okay, goals are too high. Yeah, and potentially that was causing the team to feel like they were not achievable and lose motivation. We have another one here. Targets were too high, so same thing. Yeah. Maybe Jim was focused a bit more on building personal relationships with employees. Yeah, so Jim really wanted to be liked. He wanted to be everybody's friend. And that didn't necessarily transfer to results in this particular case. So thank you for calling that one out. It started out with him telling a bunch of things instead of asking questions. Okay, I think we have some coaches in the room here. I'm wondering what would have happened if Jim asked questions instead of setting goals only based on his own views. Yeah, so very wise perspective. Thank you. I think that was Pascal. Didn't actually listen to his team members' feedback. Okay, yeah. So there's some additional things that Jim could have done here. And then one more, and then we'll move on. Jim was not listening to the feedback of the team. He's making assumptions based on his personal bias. Yeah, and so excellent observations there. And I'll also point out, like, Jim was well-intentioned. He was doing the best he could, and he cared for his team, and he was doing what he thought would be best in the particular situation. But as you've mentioned, there are potentially other ways he could have dealt with that. And I'm seeing some more trickle in here as well. So that's awesome. Okay. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to break this idea of Jim and Bob and what they did in that story down a little bit further. And we're going to tell you exactly why Bob did so well. We're also going to introduce you to a set of tools that you can use to have a performance that's more similar to Bob. And I know we've got a lot of coaches in the room. And so these are also tools that you can use with your clients, whether you're helping them develop in their leadership or just their personal jobs. So as a little bit of an introduction to Brock and I, we're both certified enterprise coaches and certified team coaches through Scrum Alliance. So we share your passion for agility, and our blend or our approach in the work we do is a blend of agile coaching, organization and relationship systems coaching, and vertical development coaching. And so we're going to bring together that whole tool set for you here today. Our company is Superheroes Academy, and as we mentioned in the chat, we're based out of Calgary, Canada, but we work globally, mostly remote, and we do a lot of leadership development, corporate facilitation, and of course, all things agile. Specifically, we have a professional coaching school that's ICF accredited, which if you haven't yet taken formal education in professional coaching and you happen to be in a coaching or a Scrum Master role, that can be something that you might be interested in. So I think Brock's going to put the link to that in the chat in a second. And by the way, our next program, which is on this topic actually of coaching leaders, is going to be starting on March 1st. Okay. So let's dig into the good stuff. Why did Bob do well? Specifically, why did he do better than Jim? And we're going to give you three main reasons, okay? And the first reason is that Bob had better human skills, okay? And specifically, Bob's got really high emotional intelligence and empathy, and he knows how to effectively navigate the relationship challenges that arise in complex team situations. Now, Bob also learned, as you pointed out, how to coach, which is a skill that he used really effectively in his leadership. Now, remember in that story, it sounded like Bob was, remiss or even negligent, like literally not doing anything, it seemed like, from Jim's perspective, in order to help his team succeed. Well, Bob was actually using all of those skills in the background, which is the reason why his leadership appeared to be effortless, or maybe even just as like luck to people like Jim. And so Bob uses these techniques to help his team set their own targets, and so that they're naturally more motivated and engaged and accountable. Bob's team pulls together to overcome those challenges, and even though he doesn't, do some of the things that Jim does, like take his team out for drinks, or as someone mentioned, trying to be their friend or whatever, he's still successful. So let's take deeper dive into some of those human skills that Bob had mastered and he was using. So we have on the screen a list of 21 unhelpful habits that many of us see in professional environments, especially with that of a new leader. And you may have noticed that Jim did some of these unhelpful habits and Bob didn't, okay? Specifically, negativity, being overly competitive, adding too much value, which is an interesting and counterintuitive one, and making excuses. So this list of unhelpful habits actually comes from Marshall Goldsmith's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, which we have a picture of on the bottom right, in which he describes tactics that actually counterintuitively help us when we're individual contributors and when we're just starting out in a company, because they help us to actually show our value and establish ourselves. But these same tactics actually become unhelpful and even become harmful when we move into a leadership role. And so this idea of effortless leadership that we're going to be coming back to over and over again in this presentation really means stopping the use of these tactics in our work and using more positive and more generative approaches to building a strong team. So Bob also understands that each relationship has its own emotional bank account. And what we mean by that is for every one negative interaction or a withdrawal from that bank account he has with somebody, Bob knows that he needs to add at least 5 positive interactions or deposits with that same person in order to keep the bank balance from going empty. So building strong teams means teaching them to deal with relationship challenges that will inevitably occur. And Bob equips his team with the knowledge of this model called the 4 Horsemen, as well as the antidotes to them and how to notice them. Bob helps his team make agreements on how they'll be together when these horsemen show up, and exactly what concrete steps they're going to take in that moment to make things right. So that coaching approach that somebody brought up earlier. Bob knows that this model as well is based on some of the best research that we have to date in human relationships, and he leverages it very effectively in a professional setting. Okay, another one on the human skills part, and I'm sure near and dear to the hearts of many of the people here. Bob used the GROW model and asking powerful questions together in the one-on-one meetings that he had with his staff. He knows, as well as his weekly staff meetings with the group together. And so he knows that using these techniques together help people solve their own challenges. Bob understood that his team members were capable, and he used a coaching approach to help them figure out how to move forward for themselves. This is one of the reasons that his approach to leadership appeared to be magic, since from the outside, it looks like his team was the one doing everything, and Bob wasn't even really contributing. Bob was also smart enough, and we'll come back to this later, mature enough to give his team credit for the achievements that they had all along the way. Now, Jim, on the other hand, of course, as you mentioned, he gave a lot of advice, and he would sort of jump into the doing of the work, well-intentioned, as a means of pushing them, towards the finish line. However, what he didn't understand was that effortless leadership means increasing our impact through other people. Okay, and then the last human skill that Bob brought to the table in the story we looked at was that when Bob's team members were underperforming, or when there was a personnel issue that he needed to confront them with, Bob learned to start the conversation using the COIN framework. Taking 60 seconds or less, he described the context of the issue, his direct observation of the behavior that was occurring, the impact that was having on the team, and what Bob would like to see happen next. He provided clarity and a way forward for his team, and in a way that would help them engage in constructive dialogue. So Bob maintained his expectations of his team and was able to deal with such challenges effortlessly using COIN. Now, Jim, on the other hand, was not familiar with the COIN framework, and in fact, he avoided difficult personnel issues as much as possible. This may have contributed to the reason why his team members started to leave, and why they might not have wanted to talk to Jim about the issues beforehand at all.
Okay. And moving forward for second thing that Bob did well, self-managed teams. In his approach to effortless leadership, Bob seems to take a hands-off approach to leading his team. But in reality, Bob understands that his role as their leader is to create an environment in which high-performing teams are likely to emerge. In addition to his masterful use of human skills, Bob leverages current research about team structure and self-management to create a stable, focused, and harmonious team environment. So what did he do specifically? So here's our analysis of what Bob did. Bob knows the research on optimal team size that says 5 to 7 people is the optimum size of the team. So Bob keeps his team small. He knows that for every person he adds to a project, the project costs increase, as does the number of communication challenges that everyone has to manage. So for this reason, every person that's added to a team that already has 10 people, it actually slows the team down. Jim, on the other hand, fell into the trap that believing that adding more people would lead to more sales happening faster. In fact, Jim actually slowed his team down and cost the company more money. This idea is accurately captured in Brooks' Law, you might be familiar with, that says adding people to a late project only makes it later. So myself and Erkan, have experienced this phenomenon many times. We've had more than a few instances where we've taken teams, larger teams, 16 or 20, things like that, and divided them into 2 smaller teams. And so if you take 16, you divide them into 2, you get 2 teams of 8. And the productivity almost instantly doubles as each team is able to deliver about as much as they did as one big team. So again, maybe counterintuitive, but works well. Also, when productivity might have taken a dip 1 month, Bob didn't panic. He stayed the course with his current team. The temptation by many leaders is to take some decisive action to right the ship. But Bob knows that stable team membership is one of the keys for high-performing, self-managed teams. Keeping teams together for 18 consecutive months leads to the best results in terms of team productivity and results. When confronted with the reality that his team was underperforming towards their sales target, Jim does panic and takes rash action by doubling his team size and personnel costs. Not only did the team have to start over at the forming stage of Tuckman's stages of group development, the team relationships just weren't strong enough to overcome the high pressure environment that existed within Jim's team. Team members started leaving, which led Jim to again add more people to make up for the lost capacity. If only Jim knew that effortless leadership is about creating a stable team environment in which your self-managing team can thrive.
Hey, Bob did a couple more things to support the self-management of this particular group. And so further research into team performance indicates quite strongly, as I'm sure many of you in the Agile space have come across, that our task efficiency actually diminishes by 20% by each additional task, project, or team that we're asked to perform at the exact same time. Okay, and that has no lower limit. If we're on 2 projects at once, we lose 20%. If we're on 3, we lose 40%. If we're on 4, we lose 60%, and so on. Brock and I just worked with a company actually where the average number of teams that each person was on was 5. So they literally spent 100% of their time. I see people's hands in their face. 100% of their time was lost to the waste of task switching, and they had no other time other than just going to their team meetings and stuff. So Bob, of course, knew this through experience, and so he kept his team members focused on their part of the overall team goal, and he limited distractions from outside the team. Okay, there's lots of distractions, the state of the economy, there was pressure from the VP to hit the targets, so on and so forth. And he allowed them to focus on whatever was the task at hand. So they got more done. Bob's team, of course, was able to meet target for the year, in large part because they were able to spend their time, again, getting things done instead of managing multiple priorities at once. Okay. Of course, not so with Jim's team. Jim brought all of those pressures and concerns of leadership into the team space, and he had people, including himself, running around with their like chickens with their heads cut off around on multiple priorities at the same time. Okay, and so remember, effortless leadership is about focus. Okay, a couple other things around self-management. So this idea of Conway's law came into the picture. So Conway's law states that systems designed by an organization are constrained to mirror the organization's communication structure. So this often leads to systems that are optimized for the wrong things because we're designing our organization inadvertently from the inside out. Now, Bob knows that flipping this law on its head, also known as performing an inverse Conway maneuver, is the best way to design systems and communication structures. So specifically, Bob set up his team up for success by designing the team structures for things like work management and communication to first mirror the communication structures that he wanted for his team, rather than by doing nothing, the way his team communicated by default would have formed their team structures and processes. Okay, so he got ahead of that. Now, Jim wasn't familiar with Conway's law and definitely hadn't heard of an inverse Conway maneuver, so he didn't take any action to intentionally design the team's processes and structures to encourage the communication flow that they needed to succeed. flipping traditional ways of working on their head, of course, is a keystone of effortless leadership, and it leads to the competitive advantage for teams that do it.
Can you give us an example of this?
Yeah, sure. So how many people are in technical work in their coaching? A lot of you work with, I'm guessing. Yeah. Okay. So as an example, if you're going to an organization and you try to create cross-functional scrum teams, or cross-functional and autonomous scrum teams, but those teams happen to be collectively working together on a structure that is a single monolithic software development application, then that structure that's embedded in the organization is going to force those teams to actually not be autonomous the way that you've designed them on the org chart. They're going to be forced to communicate in a large blob that looks like your software. And so if you want to create small, highly empowered, self-managed Scrum teams, you actually need to split up your monolithic software application into team-sized pieces of architecture, or it will fail. And so that's just one example of structure, but like physical structure, where people sit is another example that like dictates communication structures, and so on and so forth. So really intentionally designing the communication we want, not just what's on the org chart. Did that answer your question?
Thanks. Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Aaron.
Hi there. Could you give an example of what communication the not successful person did and what they should have been doing?
Sure. I'm trying to think back to the story. And Brock, if you have one off the top of your head, feel free.
Or what, did that the other guy didn't?
Yeah.
Okay, let me give me a try. How about the one-on-ones that he did? He was gathering again all the, let's say, communication back to himself, rather than bringing the team together and sharing information. Could be one.
Yeah, so that's a good example. So for instance, the way information flows from the VP through him, through the team all the time, and the team doesn't necessarily talk to their stakeholders, that might have, that organizational structure may have caused the team to work in a more hierarchical manner. Maybe, we're stretching a little bit. Something detail I could make up in the story is, I know some of the people were getting distracted by the VP in their pet projects or whatever. So maybe Jim didn't change the physical environment when he set up his team, and maybe he left some people like sitting over by the VP and not with the team, and they had difficult time focusing. So
I think another one too, Erkan, and thanks everyone for the questions, is around the work management and kind of how the team went about doing their work. And so Bob, of course, with the more self-organized manner, and team members, going out and doing stuff, solving their own problems, that type of thing. Whereas, with Bob, the work, like communication flowed through him, to the point where he actually got involved in doing a lot of the work as well. So I think that could also be an example.
Okay. Thank you.
thanks
Yeah,
for the questions. Okay, let's keep going. And this one's over to you, Brock.
I think go back one. We jumped to one there.
Yeah, you're right. We did jump one.
Yeah.
I apologize. Thank you. Okay, so actually, yeah, so this is the last one in the self-managed teams category. And so another thing that Bob did well was from day one, he taught his team about the 5 dysfunctions of the team model. and how to apply it to their work and relationships every day. So teams don't just become high performing overnight, as we all know. They take work to get there, and working on the challenges of working together as a team is where Bob knew the team should start. And so building on overcoming the dysfunction before it, Bob helped his team to navigate each of the dysfunctions to eventually overcome them all. Bob displayed his effortless leadership by going first, helping the team, mining for conflict, forcing clarity and closure, and confronting difficult issues, and finally focusing on the collective outcomes. Jim, of course, didn't have time for all of the airy or like soft stuff like this with his team. He was more about getting down to business, and he did his best, of course, by keeping his team focused on their output and their productivity. Besides, it's difficult for a team to grow and mature when under pressure, and when there's a revolving door of team members, like there was on Jim's particular team.
Can you give an example of what mine for conflict is? What does
Yeah,
it
that's one of our favorite ones, actually. So there's this idea that in order for teams to reach a state of high performing, they have to move through multiple stages. And one of those stages is a stage of conflict, okay, often called storming. So the problem is, in professional relationships, we often are incentivized to put on a professional mask and not argue with one another, not fight with one another, because we want to get along and we want to be liked. And so in professional environments, we end up with teams who never have any conflict. And so we have this false sense that the team is doing well because they're not fighting, but actually they're stuck and they cannot move, they cannot mature into a place of high performance. And so if we have a team that hasn't moved through that stage and we're their coach or their scrum master or their leader, then it's actually our job to stir the pot a little and get some fights going so that we can move them through that stage. So it's kind of a funny thing to do. And oftentimes in a supporting role, we're not willing to do that. But that's exactly what we need. We need somebody to start some, bring the elephants in the room out for discussion so that people aren't always passive aggressive.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Great. So, third thing Bob did well was this idea of leadership maturity. Bob prioritizes his own growth and development, and he knows that becoming a more mature person will only serve to increase the effectiveness of his leadership. And in turn, that will improve the performance of his team. Bob recently invested in vertical development coaching for himself, which helped him understand how he sees the world and the impact that perspective has on his leadership. He focused on aspects of his current self and leadership that would move him into a later stage of development, which unlocked Bob's ability to see the bigger picture, keep things in perspective, and better understand why his team members do the things they do. A game changer in Bob's leadership, for sure. Having not invested in his own growth, Jim remains at an earlier stage of development than Bob. Jim has trouble seeing the big picture and spends a lot of time worrying about the things he has no control over. Effortless leadership is not about worrying your way to success, but is about growing your capacity to deal with what life throws at you. So here's what Bob learned about vertical development and leadership maturity. There's a key distinction that's central to understanding adult maturity, and that's the difference between horizontal and vertical development. Horizontal development occurs when we're learning new information, knowledge, or skills, but we don't necessarily change the assumptions that we make about ourselves, other people, and the world. Our self-awareness can even remain unchanged, even as we engage in horizontal development. Vertical development, on the other hand, occurs over time as we notice marked shifts in our basic assumptions about ourselves, others, and the world. This indicates to us that adults continue to grow and that there are identifiable and measurable stages of development that adults move through in a predictable order. Our life experiences teach us to challenge our notions of what is happening. Vertical development, if this is a new concept for you, it's becoming more and more important in leadership development and in effective leadership. And it's based on empirically validated research conducted over the course of 40 years into how adults grow and learn and develop. So, Bob likes to think of this using the metaphor of altitude or like climbing a mountain to represent the impact that vertical development has on his leadership. So if you think about this mountain, right, the higher the altitude, the greater the perspective. So it's like climbing a mountain. So the higher that you climb, the further away you can see, the further out you can see. When you're at the base of the mountain, you can only see what's right in front of you, which is like the mountainside or the bushes just around or whatever. And so when we think of Bob's perspective, right, vertical development for him is about the altitude of the perspective, being able to see further. So, yeah. So Bob did the hard work, right? He worked with a leadership maturity coach. He learned more about himself and his blind spots. Something that's kind of difficult to do sometimes, but Bob accepted and improved on feedback that maybe was hard to hear for himself. And he did this over a period of years. And as a result, he was able to move ahead several stages of leadership maturity. As leaders mature, we know that they enjoy a more differentiated, integrated, flexible perspective, being capable of optimally functioning in a rapidly changing and complex world, which is something we all need in today's world with how fast it moves and changes, the complexity that's involved in everything. We also know that as leaders mature, their stage of development influences what they notice or can become aware of. And therefore, what they can describe, articulate, influence, and change expands as a person grows in maturity. We also know that the leader's autonomy, freedom, tolerance for difference and ambiguity, as well as flexibility, reflection, and skill in interacting with the environment around them increase, while defensiveness decreases.
Okay, so Bob did a lot of stuff better than Jim, and I feel like we've been kind of harping on Jim for a little too long. So we've got a bit of a big reveal for you here, which some of you may have figured out by now. But that is that Jim actually is the same person as Bob. Okay, there's no difference between the two. But by growing in human skills, the capacity to build self-managing teams, and in his own leadership maturity, Jim was able to evolve his leadership so that it looked the way that Bob's leadership does. So Jim actually, in our story here, represents a cross-section of the different leaders that Brock and I have worked with at the beginning of their career in leadership. And Bob actually represents the same people just a little further down in their developmental paths. So we've witnessed many leaders shift from being Jim-like to being Bob-like in their leadership. And that even includes us because both Jim and Bob also represent Brock and I in our own personal journey through various leadership roles that we've held. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with Jim's approach. We often demonize that idea because it wasn't as effective as maybe his more mature self. But just keep in mind that without people like Jim in the world, we won't eventually have any Bobs. And so effortless leadership is about evolving your leadership so that you too can access leadership capabilities of Bob, regardless of where you might be on your own personal journey. But unfortunately, there's a few problems with leadership development programs that exist today. At least from our perspective. The first one is that they're not tailored. Okay, so most leadership development programs are going to take a one-size-fits-all approach to training, and they're going to inadvertently target the stage of development that they want and not the one that the leaders are at or the one that maybe they need to move to next. Okay, and so this leads to wasted effort, and it's a lot like planting seeds in infertile soil that's not going to grow. The second problem is that they're not quantifiable. And so something that we like about vertical development, especially with the research-backed assessments that are available for it, are that vertical development can be measured, it can be practiced, and it can be improved upon. And so this gives us the unique ability to measure where leaders are at before and after any investment into development. So in an era that's now defined by the acronym BANI, our world's brittleness, anxiousness, non-linearity, and incomprehensibility demand more innovative approaches to our leadership and problem solving. And there's no question that we all are, companies all are experiencing tough times right now. 60% of CEOs this year believe that their revenue is going to decline. 85% CEOs globally are reducing their operating cost, and almost half of companies are currently in a hiring freeze. And so there's no question that more effective leadership and what we're calling effortless leadership is more critical than it has been before. All of these stats that I mentioned as well, they seem to be leading to a boiling point because we also have stats that show that many workers are more angry than they were before, and they're more regularly venting that anger at each other. And so the ability to build and navigate these strong relationships is a really key and important part of effortless leadership. And lastly, as we move into this, whatever you want to call it, this weird world of modern business that has all of these new societal, environmental well-being impacts, ethical considerations as we move all of our products into AI faster than we can figure out what it actually does, the necessity for effortless leadership becomes even more evident. And so the last slide we're going to share with you is just a little bit about how Brock and I aim to make a difference in the world. So as you'll remember, a couple things that separated Bob from Jim were his human skills, his effective team building, and his leadership maturity. What we bring to the table is that we're organization and relationship certified professional coaches for the human skills part. We have 20 years of building and leading self-managed teams, both through leadership roles as well as through our work as agile coaches. And we're both certified leadership maturity coaches through the Vertical Development Academy. So the way we help is we have a 2-day leadership training class. We have 3 to 6 month leadership development programs that are backed in a vertical development assessment called the MAP, which is the most tailored and finely tuned and research-backed instrument for assessment and vertical development that exists today. And we do executive coaching as well. So if you want to get a hold of us, we've got some links on the right, and Brock's going to put those into the chat. What we want to offer you today is if you liked the toolbox of tools that we introduced you to, and you want to read more about them, you can download this presentation and that full toolbox through the link that Brock just put into the chat. Part of downloading that link, by the way, is a request for one line of feedback for us on how we can improve this talk. So anything that you can give us feedback wise is greatly appreciated. And then the last link that I think we'll share is just that, yes, is it the slides or does it hold more info? It's both, yeah. And then the last one we'll share is the link to our Path to Coaching program, because again, you all are professional coaches and you might get value in learning about that, or you might know somebody who would. So with that, we'll pause and thank you all so much for inviting us to your forum here and taking the time to explore the concept of effortless leadership. And we have as much time for questions and just open discussion as you do.
And so, Erkan, maybe to kick that off as well, there's a couple of key questions in the chat that I think is useful for us to address. Christos asked, what about what Jim did right? And so, you know, it might come across, of course, that, well, Jim didn't do a whole bunch of things, but what was it that he did right? You know, and I think in a lot of ways, right, there's a lot of these things like Erkan has mentioned, we have both been and both are Jim and Bob. And, you know, team building and things like that are useful and can be helpful. And so, you know, for Jim, there's just this extension of his leadership maturity that he doesn't have yet, but which he gets later, that shows that what Bob had. And so, you know, so yeah, I mean, it can be a pretty common kind of growth trajectory for leaders in that way. Erkan, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that.
Yeah, I'll just address the last part of the question. Should there be trainings and etc.? So I think the point is that, you know, if Jim did nothing and he you know, went about his career and leadership, he probably would eventually become Bob. But waiting, you know, 20 years or whatever for that maturity to happen on its own might not be desirable. So we definitely know that we can accelerate that growth trajectory through training and targeted coaching based on where each leader is in their particular leadership maturity journey. And so that was why what I was saying about the tailored approaches is if you can specifically assess where somebody's at and then give them training, not just like leadership 101 or, hey, here's a nice book that you might enjoy, but like something specific that is, you know, what's holding them back from the next stage of development, or maybe what's like just on the next cusp for them, then you can accelerate that trajectory. And so instead of 20 years or whatever, maybe it's 5 or maybe it's 3 or whatnot. And then again, there's nothing inherently wrong with Jims. We're all Jims on our first day on the job of leadership, and so we have to invest in Jim if we want Bob.
Thanks. And so that was kind of answering the question, Demetrius, that you had in the chat there. A couple additional things that whoops, where'd it go? That came up that I think I'll just mention. A couple suggestions from participants on Jim and, you know, what he did. And so Karen had mentioned that Jim might have been able to be successful in the same organization because he had a manager at some point who did those same things, because he said, you know, he knew that style worked well for him. So perhaps that's part of, you know, where Jim was starting from. Oh, and Elena mentions a similar comment in the chat there as well, just about Jim's manager and kind of what he learned from him or her as well. And maybe luck that Bob invested in himself. Yes, and so there's definitely something about, you know, taking the time and putting in the effort to invest in your own self and leadership. It does take time, and then some of this stuff is hard, but it's worth it in the end. So yeah. So that's everything in the chat, but we're available here for other questions or discussions that you all might have. Otherwise, Harris, pass it back to you as well.
I have a question. Like, how effortless is the effortless leadership?
So that's the catch, right? Obviously, it's a lot of work to get there. But then once you've got there, both in terms of setting up systems, but also getting yourself into a place of higher maturity, at that moment, the work will feel a lot more effortless than it did before. And that's the idea.
And as a follow-up to this question, I mean, when we are entering an organization for transformation, in quote or outside of quote, we're facing some challenges, right? Cultural challenges mostly, but also others. So in your experience, what are these challenges or the, I don't know, top 3, top 5 challenges that you've came across when trying to approach the leadership development?
Yeah. Okay. So a couple things I'll say about that is because I mean, we empathize with you. Agile transformation is not easy, and we've been doing that for decades ourselves, and not always as successful as we'd like to be when we go into organizations. And so an angle to this that you maybe haven't heard before that aligns with our message to you today is that if you think of the world of vertical development, each stage of maturity, it's not just leadership maturity, this is personal maturity we're talking about. Each one coincides with a personal value system that you identify with, value system, okay? And at each stage, it's completely different than it was before. Like, just think about when you were 13 years old or something in school, what was most important to you? And now think about what's important to you now. Your values change as you grow through life. And so the reason that that's so important to Agile is at its core nothing more than a set of values. And so if we look at that on a maturity scale, it turns out that one of these stages of personal and professional maturity actually aligns really closely with what the Agile Manifesto tell us is agility. And so what's funny is when we go into organizations, we try to make everybody agile, or we try to train them into agile, not realizing that we have to mature them into that perspective. And it's actually impossible to like skip stages a lot of the times. And so that's why oftentimes we go into these companies and our message just falls flat. Like, we need a different approach, and we believe maturity is a big part of it. The second thing I'll say, because you asked like what were your top 2 or top 3, is if you look at the latest State of Agile survey that came out, leadership is and the role of leaders, whether they're bought in and the roadblocks that they're putting up or not, tend to be the biggest issue that people are reporting in their efforts to adopt agility. And so making sure that some type of development program that's aligned with your goals is included in any transformation effort, we think is critical. But of course, you don't always have the opportunity to do that, right? So that's the tough part. Yeah, what do you all feel in your work is your top 2 or 3?
I have an observation regarding about this effortless thing that I see a lot in the companies that I work, actually. And it is not for me effortless, but it is where you decide to invest the effort. In the first case, we saw that Jim was investing this effort into his team. In the second case with Bob, he was investing in him to grow himself as a leader first. So it is not effortless, but it is which direction you choose. And then it's very much connected to what you were just describing about the maturity. For me, to reach the maturity, it should be first the mindset, the awareness, the mindset, the growth, and then we can speak of any kind of maturity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of
this is
sense.
how
Thanks.
I see it.
Thanks, Elena. And I'm just realizing we haven't heard much from the people in person right now, and so just maybe intentionally creating some space for anybody who wants to either chime in on this conversation or just ask a question.
Thank you.
Totally.
We already have a queue here. So, Anastasia.
Very close to, I think, if I understood it right, what Elena said. I think one of the biggest challenges is leadership, especially in transformations. In this example, leadership feeling like there is an externalized situation that needs to be dealt with, and it has nothing to do with them and how they need to change, aka the values that you mentioned, and to assist the process and to enable the whole process of transformation. So yeah, self-realization of what do I need to change, what can I do differently.
Yeah, that's such a good one. I'm just thinking back to the story. I think Jim had a situation where he was kind of thinking that it was all macroeconomic conditions that were creating his situation, and so he maybe used that as a crutch to not look as deeply as himself as he could have.
Any other question from the room? Okay, I have another one. So you showed us this graph with the red, orange, yellow, like a velocity meter, something like this. Tachymetro, how would we call this? Speedometer, something like this, in one of your latest slides. So I suppose that, yes, this one, yeah. So is this going only up, or can it go down, like the maturity, the team formation of Tuckman's model? So when we have a change, that might put you back to an earlier stage. So is there anything that can impact the growth and the maturity of a leader so that he can act or behave in a manner that it's not so mature based on current situations?
There's a couple ways you can think about down or backwards when we talk about maturity. So you generally don't become less mature or lose access to your ability to work from later stages. However, there's situations in life that might necessitate a better response coming from an early stage. Okay, and so the idea of maturing through these stages isn't that we move from one and then forget where we came from. It's actually that we transcend and include each as we move forward, so that we're adding to our toolbox every step of the way, and we can always access any of those tools from an early stage. Now, since we're in an agile forum, what Brock and I think of, or what we mean when we talk about agility, or like especially leadership agility, is the ability to dance in between all of these perspectives based on what's needed in the moment. So you might be going back on purpose, okay? For instance, in the case of an emergency, you might be very late in your development, but you might have to be more decisive, where you like tell people what to do because there isn't time and you need to move the company or the team into a position of safety. So that would be one example. Another example of moving backwards would be just in a, unfortunate life event. brain trauma or something in a car accident, or later on in life when we start to decline cognitively, that might move you back. I don't know as much about that, but I do know what happens. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, actually, and you know what? I might actually even say one other thing about this is you'll notice that in the model it goes up and then it goes down. And so another way we can think of going back is what's actually happening in this is up to the middle stages, we're actually building our ego up as we develop ourselves and our identity in the world. And the second half is when we start deconstructing that identity and deconstructing that ego. And that's why it's kind of coming down. So there's that's a very fascinating question. Thank you. There's different layers to that one.
Yeah.
I like the last part when you're building ego and then you move on in deconstructing. Okay, thank you. And we have some other questions in the chat.
Yeah, so one I was just going to address. So there's we've had a few questions about this title of effortless leadership. And so as we've mentioned, like, it does take a lot of work to get to this point, right? And a lot of work on yourself and just learning about team dynamics and all those types of things. And so Erkan had mentioned earlier, once you kind of get to that place, leadership can be more effortless for yourself, just because of all of the tools that you have and the perspective, thinking of the altitude of climbing the mountain that you have. The other thing that we saw in our story is when Jim observed what Bob was doing, it appeared effortless to him because he was confused, like, what is Bob even doing? And he used words like, it looks like magic, or he's achieving things by luck. And so to others outside, it might look effortless, more recognizing that they just don't understand how this is working. And so, just another way that you might look at that as well. Okay. And what other, that was just what was in the chat there. So what other questions were there?
Yeah, my question was about this same image. There's some percentages and numbers in there, and I have no idea what those represent. It's quite a complex image. So I was curious about that because it goes 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 5, 6, 7, or something like that. Why not just 1 through 8? So it needs to be, it means something, right?
Yeah, so I'll let Erkan chime in on the exact numbering system, perhaps, but what you're seeing here, right? These are the different stages that adults mature through. And kind of, as we mentioned, like, as you progress through stages, you have the capabilities of earlier stages still available, should you need to use them. But you now have new capabilities that come online for you. And so, you see there's 4 stages on the left and 4 on the right. That midpoint is really important. Crossing that is a really big developmental move, where you're going, and you'll see with the, dotted lines of percentages and things there. When you cross from self-determining to self-questioning, that midpoint, that's where you're going from the conventional perspective to what we call post-conventional. And so, that's a big change in your leadership. And so, in our story, I might suggest that Jim was probably at a, stage like a self-determining or maybe a skill-centric even perspective, whereas Bob was probably in the 4 or 5 self-questioning. Just because of the way, they saw the world and how they approached the challenges that they had. And so, that's kind of what it represents there. The percentage is saying that 75 to 80% of, the population has a conventional perspective. And then, the 15 to 20% of the population would, operate out of a post-conventional perspective. And so that's, that's kind of what that all represents. And then Erkan, I don't know if you know the science behind like 2-3 and 3-4 instead of something else.
Well, so yeah, I'll say a couple things about that. So first, this idea. So what we mean by conventional is that's where most people are at in society. And so that's the level that society will support you up into. Society kind of like pulls you up into that by setting an example with those around you. What's funny about post-conventional is there aren't as many people there. So you're kind of like breaking beyond and becoming more mature than your community around you. So it's very difficult to do. Now that line, I think, is North America. And since you all are from Europe, you'll appreciate that I believe the line is a little bit more to the right when you sample people in Europe. So the just know that the conventional post-conventional line is a little bit different for you. And then if you're interested in like the science behind this and like what all the numbers mean and like how all the stages go and like where I am, we are too. We think it's the most interesting thing you can do in your personal development. And I can't recommend enough taking a maturity assessment profile. The way the test works is it's 36 sentence stems that you complete. It's like, think of an incomplete sentence. Like, when I walk into the office in the morning, ... And you just fill out whatever comes to mind. And what you end up getting back is a reconstruction of how you make meaning of the world, exactly where you are, and a really detailed write-up on like what you can focus on next to continue to mature. It's really, really powerful. So it's one of the coolest things I've done. If you're interested in that type of thing, we include it in all of our leadership development programs, and you can ask us about it afterwards. And then yeah, we go into what all the numbers mean and all that stuff at that point.
All right, thank you.
May I share? Probably I see this picture a little bit differently than everybody else, because I truly believe that for anyone to be a great leader, it is not how he or she will move the needle, but it is how it is where to know exactly where to act in which one, because a great leader sometimes need to have this construct awareness, but sometimes a great leader need also to be a group centric. And if we take, for example, Alexander the Great, soon I saw the new movie, and he was in all of this, but he knew when to be in this. So this is, for me, it's the great leader knowing when and how, but of course having the complete awareness.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Elena. And it's also the level of leadership that's most effective is going to be dictated by our environment and the types of problems that we're asked to solve. And so, we might be in an environment where one of the earlier stages is like perfect, and the later stages are actually harmful. So that's a very good point. It's more about fit for purpose, and fit for environment is for just saying like later is better or something like that.
Exactly, you spot on it. Fit for purpose. I think whatever we do, we should fit for purpose anyway, right?
No other question from here or online. So I guess we can wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights on this area.
Thank you for
Thank you for
session. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for having us, and appreciate all the feedback I've seen come in already. So thanks for sharing that with us as well. And yeah, look forward to next time.
Thank you. So,
all right, thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.